All right, welcome everyone to applications and the management thereof. I'm Craig McNally, and I'll be presenting with Vince Burrow. Next. Skip this slide. So, so the problem the point of this session is to basically to discuss applications. Currently, we're in a situation where we have a lot of modules in Folio, right? And it's becoming increasingly difficult to deal with, not just at release time, not just at deployment time, but in general. Right? There's a lot of testing that has to happen, a lot of deployment that has to happen all at the same time. And so the idea behind applications is to simplify that. Next. So here you see the top right corner, that's basically what we have today. It's a collection of modules. Some of them are business logic modules, some of them are edge modules, some of them are storage modules, UI modules, etc. And the idea is to formalize this or group those into, group them logically into applications. And so it's more like the picture on the bottom. So you have fewer things to manage, right? Fewer applications. I already mentioned monolithic, the sort of flower releases. It's the situation we're in today, where everything needs to be sort of, built and tested and released and deployed all at once. There's a lot of coordination that happens. It only happens a couple times a year. And where we'd like to be is to, once we can formalize these applications, well, it's sort of a step towards being able to break up that release cycle. Instead of having monolithic releases, release individual applications as needed. So it makes it would be a lot easier to do these things over time as needed as opposed to all at once. So I've been talking about applications, but what is an application? What do I mean by that? There's a couple different definitions in the community today. It's inconsistent. So some people refer to apps or applications as sort of the icons at the top of the Folio screen. So check in or check out. Others think it's just like a sort of blanket term for some functionality, circulation, or a collection of functionalities, even like ERM, licenses, agreements, all that stuff. So the definition that we're proposing is a minimal but complete set of elements which together are intended to deliver a specific solution to Folio. And we'll expand on that a little bit more. Next. So what makes up an application? It's essentially a vertical slice of functionality. So you can see on the right-hand side there, we have UI modules, a bunch of circles there and shapes on the right-hand side, all color-coded the same. So we have a UI module, storage module, back-end, business logic module, edge APIs, all those things would essentially constitute a vertical slice through the system. That's what we're talking about as an application here. So for example, it could be like the orders application. You have UI orders at the top, that's a UI module, and maybe some plugins as well. I think there's probably the UI find order lines or something like that. The storage module, so maybe mod order storage, obviously mod orders and edge orders. That would be an example of an application. So now that you know what we're proposing as an application, how would we describe this? How do we formalize it? So this is where this application descriptor comes in. And it's sort of akin to the module descriptors that we all know and use all the time, right? It's some metadata about the application. Here you can see it has stuff like the name, the version, a description. And the important parts here are, the modules which comprise the application, both on the front end and back end. You can see that there are plugins in there as well. And of course, dependencies on other applications. And the dependencies aren't going away just because we're formalizing this. And of course, this could be extended to include things like certification and probably other things as well. Next. So for those of you that were at yesterday's platform talk, some of this probably looks familiar. Some of these slides have been reused. Typically, we would present this from the application side up to platform, but the order of sessions is a little bit funky here, so it's essentially reversed. But so looking at this hierarchy that we're building here, we start on the right-hand side. That's what you're comfortable with today. This is what we have. It's modules. You know what modules are. You know that the module descriptors, they describe the module, and so the interfaces that they provide, the module has their own versioning and so forth. Going up to the next level in the hierarchy, we have our applications. And those are comprised of multiple modules that are also described by an application descriptor, which we just went through. And of course, they have their own versioning. And then the next layer after that is the platforms, which is a collection of applications. So we have modules, which roll into applications, applications which roll into platforms, and platforms, of course, also have a platform descriptor. They have their own version, and they basically, describe the full stack of the system, right? Everything that's in the system. Next. So for the next couple slides, I'll turn it over to Vince.
Thanks, Craig. All right, so what I'm showing you here is the idea of doing these applications came up a while back. It was described in WOLFcon, and just prior to that, thought was, well, we're going to get some efficiencies and some benefits from doing this. So I did an analysis, which was way back in April 22, so that's a year and a half ago. At the time, I looked at all the modules, every component we had in Folio, and there are 172 of them. And so I said, well, can I do this exercise and group them into what would be logical applications? Not to say that this is how it must be done, but merely, is this going to work? So I first broke it down into domains, of which I could get 22. And then I found that I could more or less make about 56 different applications within those domains. So that was a success. If I had come to the result that, well, I could take 172 components, but I would have 150 different applications, and that just wouldn't work. So the conclusion was the system was amenable to this breakdown and regrouping of applications to be efficient. So there's just here's my worksheet, a snapshot of our screenshot of what I was doing there. And so just if you're interested in statistics, this is how it kind of breaks down. You can see that you have not only can you break it down, but is there like an even distribution, or is there a good representation of the different types of components within what we have? So we can see that on the top one, you can see the distribution of back-end module, edge modules, front-end modules into the different tiers of the platform, as it were. So we have core, extended, and LSP, which we're going to call functional. So that kind of makes sense as an even distribution. It's not like we would put everything. For those who are attending the platform, there was this question of, well, we break it down, so we can remove some things from the middle tier, which is functional, and move them into extended, and thereby reduce the size of releases. So in this breakdown, you can see that you have, a good number to be moved into extended. So that would be, again, proof that it makes sense, and we can have some savings there. I just put some samples of like what any one of these particular applications might look like in terms of, this is how I put them together into applications. So there's a mix here. You can see that some have edge modules, such as the orders. Some of them have UI plugin modules, such as the data import. So we have reasonably sized applications, and they seem to work well that way. Okay. All right, great.
Thanks, Vince. So that's all about applications. The next logical question is, well, how do we get this into the system, right? So it's all about application management. So there are a couple of problems that we need to solve here. Manage the composition of applications. So what modules, basically what Vince was just going through in that exercise he did a couple of years ago is, which modules belong to which applications. Manage the entitlements to applications. So just like we have module entitlements today, that you enable a particular set of modules for a tenant, it's the same situation with applications, right? So we need to enable applications for tenants. How is that managed? And then manage the set of applications. So build out these platforms that we described. So if we're building the LSP platform, what collection of applications go into that? If we're building the ERM platform, what collection of applications go into that? So to start off with application registration, there's a new thing on the screen here that's the application manager on the picture there. There's a new component that we're introducing or proposing here. And that's essentially sits on top of the existing system. you would register your application descriptors with this application manager, and that's how the system knows about it, right? They would, these application descriptors would reference the module descriptors. That's where you see these module descriptors going to the application descriptor. And so the application manager knows about not just the applications, but the modules that comprise those. And of course, the way that this would work, or could work, is that the application manager, as you register applications with it, it would broker calls to a copy. It would make the necessary calls to register the corresponding modules for the copy. So for the entitlement part, I kind of touched on this already. Again, this application manager has a responsibility here. So it would need to know about tenants and which applications you want to register for which tenant. And it would again broker calls to a copy to essentially enable the corresponding modules in that application for the tenant. And there's some application storage here. You can see the sort of the database or persistence layer here, so that you can query the application manager and see what applications are enabled for a tenant, what applications are registered for, in this deployment of Folio and so forth. So there's some persistence layer in the application manager, but for the most part, it's brokering a lot of the calls back to a copy. So managing the set of applications, this is about the platform. And we did go into this a little bit more detail at the platform talk. So I think a lot of you probably were there, but for those of you that missed it, I'm pretty sure it was recorded. You can check it out afterwards. But basically, as I mentioned before, we're grouping these applications into certain platforms. So the examples that we used were like the LSP platform, the ERM platform, and so forth. There can be multiple platforms. I already talked about that. It's consistent with the notion of something like platform complete, where it's essentially a platform essentially describes what the system is, a full stack. We even go as far as to mention things like virtual applications, which would allow you to capture the versions of like infrastructure that are required. So Postgres and Kafka, things like that. Vince kind of touched on this already, but the platform is comprised of 3 different tiers. So that core tier, which is the same for each platform. So that's the common part. On top of that is the functional tier, which is sort of the basic stuff that comprises that platform. And then the top tier is the extended tier, and those are things that are sort of optional. So things like typically for integration with external systems and so forth, that not everyone that's running an LSP or the LSP platform would necessarily need everything in an extended tier. Some would, some wouldn't. So for application of the UI, I'll turn it back over to Vince.
Okay, thank you. All right, thanks. So one of the concepts in doing the applications this way is that we are somewhat shifting how Folio appears from horizontal slicing, so that we don't, we have a backend release, all the backend modules together, and then there's the front end modules, which are distributed and built using different systems, and obviously they have connections between them. They rely on each other, and as shown in that earlier diagram, when you get a vertical slice, you have to sort of account for which UI modules go with which backend modules, because they're obviously related to each other. So part of the there are challenges for doing this, and we have to, rethink a little bit how we build the front end. And there are some things that we take for granted because of the way that we build the current UI front end using sort of a monolithic approach. So one of them is going to be, how do we get from the current build system? So we have currently a system where we're needing to build tenant-specific UI bundles. So if you are a particular tenant on a Folio system, you will have a certain number of modules or applications enabled, which was shown on the previous slide. And then, you will get a UI bundle created that only includes the UI modules that you need. And every tenant, therefore, has a separate kind of build for their own distribution, many of which could be the same, but many of them will not be the same. So in order to be consistent on the tenants we end up having to scale linearly, essentially. That means that if you have 50 tenants on a system, you will have 50 UI bundles, and if you add 50 more, you're going to be building 100 UI bundles, whether or not they're the same. So it scales linearly in an unfortunate way. So to support the vertical alignment, what we have to do is say, stop thinking about the UI bundles as one big bundle that represents everything you have as a tenant, but think about it as this is just the UI that you need to go with this particular application that you are receiving. So we're shifting to an application-centric UI bundle, which means essentially that you will receive multiple bundles in your UI, which is a shift in how we do things currently. There will be, the bundles will be smaller. We'll have, application level bundles, but there'll be more. And that poses some challenges. But on the other hand, it's benefit because now it doesn't scale linearly by tenants, but it scales linearly by number of applications you have on the system. So if you have 50 tenants, however many applications you have, you add 50 more, you still have the same number of application UI bundles because it represents how many applications you're offering on that system. So that is definitely a benefit. Okay, go on. So there are some issues with doing that because first of all, we have to tackle one problem, which is the initial loading of the UI. So if you're familiar with it, in Folio currently, you first time you access Folio, you will have a bit of a delay while you download the entire large bundle that you have for every application that you are entitled to. So in this mechanism, we don't necessarily have to do that. So we can strip it down, we can make it a little more efficient by having essentially just the bundle you need to get going in Folio. And as you access applications, we have the opportunity to dynamically to load the bundles later on as you go. So what this also means though, is that we're shifting the determination of what UI bundles you need, what UI components you need from a build time process with the mega bundles to a runtime process. So if we don't give you all the stuff up front, then we have to figure it out once you're in the application already. Currently, we do it on the back end, we do it with build UI bundles. So that allows us a number of different shortcuts to get going. So these to the next slide. And so the so we can update different applications independently. This is one of the things that we get to. Actually, here.
It's not echo,
Someone's not muted.
Should be all set.
Okay. Yeah. So one of the goals we want to achieve with this application level thing is that we want to allow applications to have their own development lifecycle and release lifecycle, so that we can release a new version of, say, circulation without having to re-release the whole platform every time. So we can have the ability to say, well, we verify this new version of applications, it works fine. You can just take this and install it on a previously deployed Folio. But that poses another challenge for the UI, because now the UI has to be aware of the fact that it has to grab a different UI bundle for the browser than the one that was in there previously. So, we can have a number of systems for doing this, but the issue we have now is, one of the shortcuts we take advantage of with how we distribute UI is that we can figure out all that versioning of which UI versions you need at build time, because it is a build time problem. If we move it to the runtime problem, then we have to figure out dynamically, well, is there a new version of this application that I need to get a new UI bundle for? And that is not something that exists currently. The front end is pretty much detached from the back end and the servers when you start running. So we need to have some sort of a trigger whereupon we can say, oh, I should go check to see if there's anything new that I need to load on the UI. Fortunately, we have a separate piece of work going on in Folio, which is to enable refresh tokens. And for those of you not familiar with this, we want to introduce a refresh token mechanism in Folio authentication, whereby instead of being granted a token when you log in, which is good for a very long period of time, we will grant you a refresh token and an access token. You use your access token to to do operations, and then that access token will expire in a very short amount of time. And the system will automatically check to see if you have a refresh token. If you do, it will transparently use it to get you a new access token. So you cycle through a number of access tokens, etc. Now, what's interesting about this is that the system that is doing that checking and making use of the refresh token is the front end system. It's part of Stripe. It's going to be part of Stripes. So this gives us a hook where we can say, well, I think I need to, the UI of Stripe says, I need to go check now that I can refresh my tokens. Well, I'm at it. Let me just check the system if there's any new UI bundles to grab. So this is an approach we're doing now. We can take advantage of that and benefit from the work that's being done to use the events that are being generated there. And so another consideration of the dynamic loaded applications is we can't just do this whenever we want, right? So there has to be a little more consideration. If you're working in the middle of something, doing a workflow, and all of a sudden your application changes before you hit the save button or something, that's going to be a problem. So we have to also synchronize when these new UI updates are provided with what the user is doing at the time. And probably the best way to do that is to put some sort of a user activated option on the screen. As you might see in some, the systems that push in, browsers do this to say, there is a new update available, press this button to initiate the update when you're ready. So that when you finish up your work and you can click the button and then grab the UI. So there is a UI, there is a user activated piece to this, namely the system will determine that a UI update is available, and then the user will have to initiate that update when it's convenient. Okay. Another shortcut or advantage we have currently in the building system of UI bundles is that we can do linking statically within the bundle. So if you are entitled to a number of UI modules, some of the UI modules will have links that they present to other UI modules that you are entitled to. So the problem is, how do we do this in an application-centric approach? Because we can't do it statically. We don't have the entire picture to which to build a UI. So there's going to be the need to achieve this dynamically through the runtime processes to identify, well, there's a link that has to be created, that's going to be produced here in this UI, and it needs to link to this other UI. How do I get there? So this means that we were going to have to define something for doing that. There are a number of mechanisms for doing this, but further thought is needed. So, the link resolver is essentially one way to do this kind of thing. You can have sort of generic links placed in the UI themselves, and then they will be resolved through the link resolver at runtime. Okay. Okay. So having applications formalized and part of the platform this way is an opportunity it's an enabler essentially for other things that we've been talking about. And one of the things we mentioned at last year's WOLFcon was to change the boundary on the microservices. So the bounded context defines the boundary of the microservices. And currently, it looks something like the diagram in the top right, which is you have the microservice is the black box, and it has an API to it. And what happens internally to it, there's backend modules that are there, and they own the storage, and only they own the storage. And the only way to get at the storage is to access the API that the module offers. Now, if we can formalize applications, we can move that boundary to include not just a single application, but the set of applications, the single module, but the set of modules together form the application, meaning that two modules in the same application, as shown below, can actually share the same storage. And this will lead to a number of efficiencies because right now you get a lot of traffic that goes through the API level. If you have one business logic module that needs to access the storage controlled by another one, and it gets especially bad if you need to do any sort of intersection of data, you're doing a join or anything like that, you grab one large data set, another large data set, you intersect it in a business logic module. If you had the ability to, from that business logic module, go directly to storage and do something, that would certainly be a benefit. It would make the system faster, more efficient, and cleaner. We could probably reduce some of the code that's in there. And one of the things about this also is that, sorry, I forgot my thought. So there is another point to this, but by having this in place, yes, I remember now. It also enables the option to create what was discussed very early on in the project, which is to have extension modules, so that you can write an application, write some modules, and you want to, you know, enhance that with just a little module that does something else. You know, it could be like, for example, something that validates checksums on a barcode or whatever, and you could write that module, and if it had direct access to the storage of the main module that manages that data, you can create extension modules or extension applications to do that. So that's a plan. Am I going here? Yeah.
That's good.
Okay. So, you know, so just to summarize a little bit, so what are the benefits and why are we doing this? What do we gain from having application formalization? So one is to have better alignment between the front end and back end modules. So we can see which modules, you know, they can work together better. They can have, you know, coordinated release of the modules and back end and front end together. We can streamline the UI build and the deployment, so we can make that dynamic linking, the dynamic loading, and the release of modules on the front end a little more flexible. And most importantly, we have the option now to create independent application lifecycles. As I mentioned before, if we have one particular application that needs to, you know, evolve quickly and add a lot of functionality, it can do that without waiting necessarily on the next monolithic release of Folio file release to make its function available. As long as we can have compatibility with the existing version, then that will certainly allow for accelerated development. And we also, you know, we can improve our dependency management, because the way we do dependencies is good within one level of things, within the UI, within backend modules, but we don't necessarily have a great deal of control over how dependencies are managed in the code builds. You know, we have GitHub, we use tags and branches for doing things. If we formalize applications and platforms with a versioning scheme of their own, then we can have a very deterministic way of establishing exactly what you're getting and when you're getting it. So,
One other benefit that isn't listed here, but we touched on yesterday during the platform talk, was that this is one of the things that would be required to get us eventually to an app store and app marketplace. So obviously, applications in the name, app store, app marketplace. So it's important. I just want to mention that because it's not on the list.
So we got it. And so with all benefits, obviously the time of cost, but challenges here. So one of the challenges that, you know, I had this analysis and I can dreamily sort of, you know, logically put modules together into applications, but the reality is there's a lot of coupling between these modules now. We have a lot of dependencies, right? Some places are worse than others. You know, inventory is the worst. It's a little monster in its own right. But so we have to break those dependencies somewhat in order to do this. And I don't think it will be possible to sort of say, okay, let's do this application restructuring and just we'll do it for the next release. It's just too much there. So we're going to have to do this incrementally, do it a piece at a time. And maybe, you know, instead of getting those 50 applications, maybe the first pass, we break it down into larger applications, which encompass those dependencies, but maybe at the domain level, instead of showing 22 domains, we can do it that way, and then break it down further, you know, instead of taking it a piece at a time and iterating over the implementation of this. So that's one of the challenges, definitely. We would also, you know, have to introduce this application level version, which we don't currently have. So that's a new thing that we have to think through and manage, and dependencies, and how, you know, if you upgrade something, if you need to upgrade a module which belongs to an application, then you have to bump up the application version. And the compatibility that we need to check between different parts of the system shifts from compatibility between modules to compatibility between applications. So that's going to take some doing. Aligning the front end and back end modules sounds easy, but there's some challenges there. We have to make that, making that work is not trivial. And if we say, going back to that first slide, how we use the word app or application ambiguously, if we claim the name application for this kind of structure, then we may have to come up with new names for the things that are currently sometimes being called apps. Most notably the icons that appear for the toolbar.
There are other challenges, not less technical, but more sort of that the community would face. Sort of, we're most of us familiar with the module evaluation process for the TC and TC. Obviously, this would impact that. We'd have to rethink how that's done. Another area is maybe we might need to rejigger some of our development teams, how they're organized, depending on those application boundaries, because it would make sense to have a development team, one development team that's responsible for an application as opposed to 5 different teams all trying to work on the same application. It's just not going to work very well. So other things to consider.
Okay, so then the thing is, how do we get there? How do we do this? So we have to do this incremental approach that I mentioned about how we break them, we break down, we group them into large groups and then break the groups down into smaller groups. Independently of the grouping exercise, we do have to, for a number of reasons, not just this reason, reduce the dependencies that exist between modules. And then eventually, those larger applications reduce the dependencies as well. We, once we, in the project, we have sort of a logical assignment of the responsibility of different modules to different development teams. And so we will probably need to shift that a little bit now because the responsibility will shift to including the UI and the backend modules for a particular application, which currently may not reside with the same team. So we'll have to shuffle development responsibility on that. We'll have to change the build automation. So the processes we have now for builds, whether it's the developer systems or whether it's the release, we'll have to start accounting for applications within that build, not simply using the modules that you do now. And obviously, there's going to be a great deal of updating to do on the testing mechanism that we have. We use testing. We have to test at the application level, as I mentioned before. When you bump up the module, you bump up the version of the application, and we have to ensure compatibility between applications. So, and the last thing to do, obviously, is to figure out how platform life cycles evolve relative to application life cycles. Meaning, you have a particular release of the platform, a certain version, you have your application. At some point, you're going to make changes that depend on something no longer compatible with that platform. So we have to figure out the mechanism that says, sorry, you can't have this version of the application unless you update your platform before you do that. So there's an evolution there. Craig mentioned earlier, one of the things we can do with this, once we formalize applications, it becomes an enabler to getting to this place where we would have app stores or marketplaces for delivering applications. And the point of that is to expand the number of things that are available in Folio. Because when you do that, you're inviting third parties to contribute not just resources like developers who are writing code that someone else has come up with, but to actually allow experts in certain domains to create an entire application in Folio, make it available in an app store, and make it possible to expand the reach of Folio at the same time. So we have, it shifts a little bit. It encourages organizations to participate at a different level. And we've seen this. We've seen this in the Folio project already. We've seen some teams have contributed sort of wrapped up applications that have been validated and gone through the various councils. I'm thinking particularly of Calendar app that was rewritten, by a development team in Alabama, and, it was a success. All right, so that's that. So we left some time at the end here because this is a proposal for some very challenging ideas. And I'd like to hear the feedback and any questions that people have, the reaction to this approach.
So since there was one question in the chat, I think it relates to the bounded context stuff. So maybe I didn't get it correctly, but what would be the sense of a storage module if the BL module can directly access the database?
That's a valid question, and basically the concept of the storage model will play. And independently of doing this, this bounded context expansion, there is a separate consideration, which is, do we just make the storage module concept go away? The history of it goes back, a ways to the start of the project, where we were thinking initially, just do the history lesson, that it would be convenient to not tie Folio to a particular storage choice. So you may want to run Folio on MongoDB, or you may want to run it on Postgres. So the idea there is you push a business logic module, and you have the storage module be concerned with the intricate details of using one particular database versus another. And then you should swap up and build a new storage module if you wanted to go with a different type of storage. So we've gone away from that. Like, we've sort of solidified around Postgres SQL as the one choice for the Folio project. It simplifies a few things. So you'll see the separation between business logic and storage modules in the older pieces of Folio, where we had that initial idea. But I think that independent of all these applications, we should consider collapsing together those two functionalities anyways, and do away with them. Any other questions on chat?
That was it.
Right.
Brooks?
Brooks?
What role do you see for things like what role do you see for things like Kafka in this context in terms of interactive communication and things like that?
So Kafka is, we touched on Kafka a little bit yesterday on the platform discussion, in the sense that it would be, on the one hand, represented as sort of an external component that needs to be accounted for in the platform definition. But I think Kafka has a role because, especially in the event-driven features that it enables, so that when it comes to reducing dependency between the different modules that exist now, Kafka can be a solution in many cases, so that we have sort of a messaging approach rather than direct call. So rather than having one module say, I need to call this API over here because it's part of my workflow to create something in some other application. Meaning that's the company, because it needs to know what the API is, it has to keep up with changes to that API and know how to call it. It just says, hey, I've done this thing, put it up on the messaging system in Kafka, and then the other module would say, oh, looks like a message that I want. Let me deal with that and what I need to do. So each module becomes responsible for performing the actions that it needs to do. So that's one clear use of Kafka in this case. Yeah.
I don't know how helpful it is to like dream of things, but I was wondering about this made it easier for like alternate UIs. So like within inventory, there's this ongoing battle between like a UI for catalogers and a UI for people that use federation. So could somebody build UI specifically for sort of resource access people and give those folks access to that main inventory and that person?
That's an interesting idea. My initial reaction is that it would probably actually make it more difficult, because if we, in the current mechanism, we have that horizontal separation, so it'd be relatively easier to lob off the UI piece and place it in the new one. If you are going to do the vertical slicing, then you have applications instead. If you want to change the UI, you're probably going to need to create an application that uses the same module, maybe, but then has a different UI component. But that's an interesting problem. And it is, I haven't thought through that one, but what's interesting with that is one of the assumptions here is that A particular module belongs to one and only one application, so the module is delivered by one application. So if you have two applications which really only distinguish themselves by the UI they offer, they couldn't really share the same module, so maybe the solution would be put multiple UI modules.
I was gonna say that, that's it.
Yeah.
So you might have a UI inventory cataloger. Yeah, so to continue that example, you might have a UI inventory cataloger and a UI inventory standard, or whatever it is, right? And they both live in the inventory app. And you could, control whether or not the user sees one or the other or both via permissions, and just like.
Yeah.
Hi, too loud, sorry. I appreciate how this has evolved through the different presentations, and one of the things I was gonna call out is what Dan just mentioned. In a previous version of this, you had that limitation that an individual module could only be in one application. I don't see any technical reason that has to be the case, and that's a perfect example of why I would want it not to be the case. Yes, you would have to redefine a different application to include that different UI module, and then redefine a different platform to include that application. But I don't see any reason you couldn't, to then not have to include the version of the UI module in that instance that you did.
So one of the reasons why the limitation is still there, I think, is because of that diagram where we have, showing how the application manager is brokering the registration of the modules, because this is a layer we built on top of the Folio system. Well, copy only knows about interfaces that are coming from modules and knows how to deal with that. So the application manager would essentially, it would know what applications, nothing down below knows about applications. When the modules get registered, if two different applications come in and they happen to have the same module for different versions, now we get a version collision potentially at the lower level, because lower level doesn't really know about application details. So I've got these two versions here, and it adds to the complexity. So the reason for limiting that is to have better control of version and what was to do before that.
So you shouldn't have the same module deployed twice in the same running system, but you could have the same module in two different applications, only one of those applications in use.
Yes, that's true. But we want to make it work for all the different scenarios.
Well, no, but Jen's scenario, sorry, I think Jen's scenario is an example of why that flexibility is valuable. I think we have a number of institutions in the wider community who might not want a particular standard UI module or repackage it with a different version of that, either for some or all users, where they might want to even permanently not use UI-foo, but definitely use mon-foo. So bundle that separately.
Okay. Okay. Next.
So modules are, as you just mentioned, just bundles of interfaces. And I guess I'm wondering, because of that fact, an application could just be seen as like a large bundle of interfaces across a bunch of different modules. So I guess one of my questions is, why isn't an application just a long list of interfaces, as opposed to the specific bundling of a module? And the reason I ask this is because I created a module with a different name that implemented all the same interfaces. I guess I'm having a hard time thinking through what the implications would be for an application. It seems like, at least in theory, I ought to be able to swap that into the application, but I wouldn't be able to because the application descriptor is explicitly naming a certain module for inclusion. And anyway, I guess you get what I'm getting at.
Yeah, you're going to, but in a way though, so one of the benefits here is that rather than having to coordinate 172 different things in a release, we now have to coordinate 50 things, 50 applications. So we're thinking at a higher level, it's a scalability thing. If we start focusing not just on the modules anymore, but on the interface, we're going down in the other direction. So now we won't have 172 modules to worry about will have, 500 interfaces. And so I could do it, but I'm not sure that's beneficial to do that. It would make it high confusion.
I also think it's an oversimplification because remember that an application is not just back-end modules, it's front-end modules, edge APIs, all these things, right? And so not all those provide interfaces. Edge modules don't provide an interface, UI modules don't provide an interface, neither do plugins. So it's an oversimplification, I think. It's an interesting idea, but it definitely deserves a lot more thought. And going back to what McAfee was saying, and the question earlier, I think there are multiple ways to do this, right? There's nothing saying that if you want to have an alternate user interface for inventory that's specific to catalogers, you could create an application that has just that UI module. That's perfectly reasonable. And then you could enable that on top of the standard inventory application or whatever. And if we need to slice things that way, where we have an inventory and then application which doesn't even that may provide one implementation of a user interface and another implementation of another application that provides an alternate, you can do that. Ian?
What was the end next?
Sorry, this was Terrence.
All right, I was curious about what you perceive as the relationship between applications, product owners, and SIGs.
Yeah, it will have to be readjusted accordingly. I sort of touched on that a little bit. I was suggesting that development teams are maybe not necessarily aligned with the right UI and backend modules. It could well be that the SIGs need to shift, but on the other hand, to some extent, many of the SIGs are already kind of at the level of applications. They concern themselves that way. There are some SIGs are broader and they go across what would be naturally, applications. And we have to figure out, where they want to go with that. They want to divide themselves up or join up with one sort of standard. But I think it shouldn't matter. Product owners go with the development teams really. And so that would parallel whatever change in development teams we would be doing. Got a question here next.
I don't really have an opinion on any of this, but I'm not across all the detail, but my question actually follows on from your question. So let's assume we reach agreement on your architectural design and change, right? First question is, how long will it take? Because you're talking about incremental approach, right? I mean, there's certain things you have to do ahead of time, that everything will work, and then another time you do that. You're talking about changing almost the entire way the monolithic project works with regards to tests, development cycles. We've got a lot of things that have been determined over the last number of years, and now suddenly you're changing all that. And I guess you're not totally throwing everything out, but you're really changing things. Like the dev team suddenly wasn't involved for a UI, now they are, and split things up. How long do you anticipate that change to take? Because now from a tech perspective, we get all eye on changes in the tech and how to make it work. I think from end users' perspective, I don't care about this. They care about features and things like that. So I'm just would be right in saying that potentially new features and new things, that cadence would slow down a bit while you make the change, and then eventually things begin to speed up again. Would that be the case? Because I've seen many other products do this before, and they underestimate how much work it is to change the entire vibe. And it takes them you did 12 months, it takes them 3 years. And so I'm just wondering if you have any kind of feel on that?
Yeah. Right.
It's,
Yeah.
2 weeks, sprint.
What time is it? No, it's a valid point, and this slide kind of illustrates that, consideration, because what we're doing here is we're not taking, the whole system, scrapping it, building on top of what's there. So we're adding a layer for the application manager, which is a broker to the existing system. So it doesn't need to disrupt everything. And that's also the reason why we have to do this incrementally, right? So let's regroup these things, and there'll be some investment of time and resources to do that regrouping, to do some dependency reduction, but we have to do that anyways. I mean, you have to take a step back on any project of this age and clean things up, so we'll have to do that anyways. And in the end, though, even if we do have some consumption of resources to making this, you know, additional thing, it could still benefit us because we'll be more efficient afterwards. But we don't want to do, you know, something that brings the system to a halt, to a halt and rebuilds it completely, because we have a well-established system. That's my impression. Do you have any? That's my impression.
So there are pieces to this that I think could happen in parallel to model development, feature development, right? In fact, there's some proof of concept stuff around module federation, which is an enabler for the UI specific bundles, the app specific bundles, which is happening in the community today, right? I think Sparrow Score is doing some work there. So, and that's happening today in, you know, in parallel with feature development and copy development, whatever else. So, the development of an application manager, for instance, shouldn't impact teams today. Of course, some capacity would need to be allocated to work on that. But in general, I think another consideration is, we just talked about maybe having to reorganize teams, adjust processes in the councils, do those sorts of things. That's gonna take time too, and we've seen how slow some of that, you know, it's a big ship to turn on some of these things, and so it takes some time. It's hard to say how fast we're gonna go do this stuff. Go ahead, Jeremy.
I know you asked them this question, but my perspective on your question is that I mean, clearly a lot of this is additive, but that certainly is not the whole picture because of the interdependencies that would be in the future stay inappropriate between modules. So it would necessitate a lot of changes in a lot of modules in order to keep them within their boundaries. Inventory, for instance, you mentioned, like, you know, that there would need to be some taming of those, you know, functionalities that are dependent and solutions that, you know, allow us to operate within an application boundary. And likewise, the multi-bundle distribution on the front end would require like large changes and stripes in order to achieve that. So
Zach says no.
Zach says no. Okay. All right. Well, in my imagination, it seems like it would require some changes on the front side of it. So you know, I do appreciate the fact that like the huge portions of this are additive, but it does seem like it would have an impact on the status quo within the modules as well.
I'll just add that the changes that we're talking about are enabling the ability to address pressures that the project is already facing. So some of the things we've been talking about were kind of stuck with our current structures and processes, like, you know, the module review process, things like that. And having a higher level of application, if we can speak in Discord, wouldn't seem to, it wouldn't force them to change things, but it would allow us to change things and things that we want to change.
I would sort of add that I'm not trying to be negative about it, I'm trying to be for this, by the way. I'm just asking those other questions because change takes time. And I think it really is good. I think the end goal, if we could get to a place of marketplace or perhaps or even report kind of like an Atlassian style thing, we could plug in. And I think it could lead to a lot of innovation in the product space, and particularly for smaller things that some institutions want. But to kind of go through and get it accepted into the core product is it's just way too big. It's way too cumbersome. And so then you've got shadow little apps living out on individual servers everywhere. And it also will enable people who've worked in this for a while, who might actually be able to sound sick of this, and might develop an odd module and sell it at $1,000 a year or something. That can become an income stream for some of the people as well in whatever they want to do. So I think that's a really positive development. But yeah, that's a deep, strong leadership. I think this is the thing I'm trying to say. I can see that.
I appreciate that, and I completely agree with you. It's an opportunity, and to piggyback on what Todd was saying, we are stuck. I mean, this is an opportunity to clean house at the same time to allow us to move faster and better with the things that we have to do next. And we are at a point where, you know, the project as a whole has to deal with some significant challenges of scale and everything else. We have national libraries, Congress, and all these things that are going to need some additional development applications and everything else.
If module A calls module B with an API, then there's the dependency. And how can you reduce dependencies when the module A still calls module B?
So there's a couple ways to do that, two ways to do it. So obviously one way is to put module A and module B in the same application. So that is kind of maybe the first pass where we have these mega applications. We avoid the dependency by putting it in the same. But then further down the road, we touched on Kafka a little bit. So if we change from a synchronous mechanism where A calls B, but we have an asynchronous mechanism where messages are passed through a message system, that is a way to reduce dependencies as well. And in the end, there are some architectural changes that we also apply to remove the need altogether to call module B. There are places in the system, and again, that monster of inventory comes to mind, where one of the biggest problems we have is high dependencies on inventory items. Inventory items carry status.
Замьючений.
Okay, and the status is overloaded from different workflows from different applications. So if we can break that and let the workflows live within applications, then we no longer need to have to call that at the